Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the National Archives Foundation's virtual program series. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. We're delighted to have you this afternoon. We've got a special guest for you coming up, and I hope you've been tuning into our program. It was July 4th, earlier this week, listening to the director of the LBJ Library in Austin. This programming is for you. This is our way of opening the doors of the archives, getting access to those treasures, even though the building in downtown and those facilities around the country are closed right now. Hopefully you've been receiving our American Experience newsletter on Tuesday, or History Snacks newsletter on Friday, which is designed for our younger viewers. And those are a lot of fun and a great way to stay connected to the archives during these times. If you haven't had a chance to visit our website, archivesfoundation.org, it's a great way to keep up to date on what we're doing during the closure and make sure you don't miss any of these programs. Today, we're delighted to have the 26th President of the United States with us, but before we begin, he will be taking questions later, so I want to make sure you know how to ask a question. You can use the chat function to the right of your screen on YouTube and ask your question either while he's talking or when we get to the Q&A section. And just for practice, right now, why don't you type in where you're viewing from, what part of the country. We always love to see who's watching today. And then later on, I'll hopefully give your hometown a shout out. So send us your city and state. And now I would like to introduce our guest. I'm honored to introduce someone who tamed the Wild West, served in the military with distinction, made public service an anchor of his life at the local and national level. He's been called a rough rider and a bull moose. Hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about that today. Please welcome our 26th president, President Theodore Roosevelt. President Roosevelt.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Oh, thank you so much for having me here. I am delighted to be here with you. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm gratified to be here with the archives, as it were. I'm very pleased to hear that there is a building for it now. Within my lifetime in administration, we were forced to keep records in basements, and so I'm glad to see that things have improved for you. But it is a great pleasure to be here with you. As Mr. Madden happily said, I am Theodore Roosevelt, lest you mistake me for Grover Cleveland or William Howard Taft. But indeed, I am very happy to be here with you this afternoon and to speak a little bit about my life and to share some times of questions. I am very pleased to be here today. And I'm a very happy New York City born and raised citizen. I am I believe, the first president who was born in New York City, if my memory serves me correctly. But I had a very good life, although I considered myself to be a man of no great talent or importance, but I did the best I could with what I had. I will say that I was born in New York City to a northern father and a southern mother, if you will. My father was born in New York and my mother came from Georgia. Of course, that made things very interesting when I was growing up during the Civil War, and my parents were not of the same opinion on such a thing. I actually, once when I was young and I was victim to a bit of a maternal discipline that I was not very fond of, I was sent upstairs for evening prayers, and I knew that my mother would hear me. And so I prayed very loudly and fervently for the victory of the Union arms. Fortunately, my mother had a good sense of humor, so she was too tickled to actually punish me. Although she warned me not to repeat the offense, lest my actions would be reported to the true meter of punishments, my father. But my father was a fine man. We all loved him dearly, and we would have done anything to please him. I was very gratified for his kind and generous spirit. But I also was very greatly appreciative of nature. Oh, yes, growing up, I had a fine penchant for seeing plants and animals of all kinds. When I was young, I actually began to marvel at every plant and creature that I stumbled upon. And of course, those of you who have spectacles will understand that before I received my first pair of spectacles, stumbling was the only way that I found them. But I was marveled I marveled at everything that I discovered. And somewhere along the way, I just had the idea that I should become a man of science. And I very quickly began a career as a zoologist at age 10 because I was a very delicate child. I suffered very much from the asthma, and my parents would occasionally send me outdoors to go find breakfast. And I would go up to a market on Broadway, and there at the market one day, laid out in the window on a slab of wood, was a dead seal. Oh, and that seal filled me with every sense of excitement and adventure that I had ever read about in my adventure books as a child. And as long as that seal was in that window, I haunted that market at every opportunity. Oh, yes, and I took notes in my notebooks. I bothered the shopkeepers constantly with my questions. And when they sold that seal, I received a fine prize. The shopkeepers gave me the seal's skull. Now, this is a picture of it. It's the actual item is in the American Museum of Natural History, but this is a portrait of it, and this was a fine specimen to have. And so I took this little skull home with me, and with the help of my cousins, we established the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. And we had a fine collection of birds and squirrels and field mice and turtles. And unlike my father's Museum of Natural History, my museum actually had living animals as well. The housekeeping staff was not always happy about that, but I was fascinated by nature, and it pursued me, and I served nature to the best of my ability throughout my whole life. Oh, I had a wonderful time of it, yes. And of course, as I mentioned, I suffered very much from the asthma. And one day, my father, he looked at me, he called me down into the parlor, and he addressed me for the very first time in my life as Theodore. And he sat me down and he said, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. And without the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body. And it will be a long drudgery, but I know that you can do it." Well, I will tell you that, as I said before, we would have done anything to please our father. And so I held my head up high and I promised him that I would do it. But, of course, he was absolutely correct. It was a very long drudgery. I recall having to use such items as these things, called Indian clubs. These were called so because of being from India, and they were weighted wooden sticks. And I had to stand like so, and I had to lift the Indian clubs with this sort of excitement. Are you ready for the exciting exercise of lifting the Indian clubs? And then I would do it again. And then I would do it again. Over and over, exercise after exercise. It was about that exciting. And it was a very long drudgery. And after all of that, I did not gain any great momentum in my body for several years. But certainly my father showed me the importance of living a good, rugged life. My apologies, my spectacles are being a bit cantankerous today. But it certainly served me throughout the whole of my life, particularly when I went out into the Badlands ranching. I had a fine time, as Mr. Madden, I believe, mentioned, my taming the West, as it were, although I will tell you it was fairly wild even after I left. But I had a very good time of it. I went there to hunt a buffalo, and I ended up with 1,200 head of cattle instead, because I was so fascinated by the beauty of the Badlands that I decided it was necessary that I should invest in some cattle ranches there and live out on the plains of the Little Missouri. And I had a wonderful time. And time in the Badlands helped truly restore my mind and body and spirit, and helped return me to the value of hardihood and instant decision. It certainly helped me very much. And it did help me return to what I had originally decided to be, which was a servant of the people, to serve in the public arena as a member of government. And I did so at an earlier age, actually, right after I graduated from Harvard University. I determined that I should serve in the state government. And I became the youngest elected member of the New York State Assembly. And I very quickly began to try and take on all sorts of things all by myself. I tried to take on change and corruption, and I did everything by myself. And I rose like a rocket. I got a great deal of attention in the press. But then an unfortunate thing happened, and I learned a terrible lesson. And the lesson was that I was not all important. The truth of it was that in order to make things change, I had to work along the give and take of my fellow assemblymen. And that is a lesson that stood with me throughout the whole of my career. I was very pleased to know that I needed to work with people. We needed to work together in order to make things happen. And I hope so those of you who are younger will remember that it's good to work together rather than try to take on everything all by yourself. But of course, it served me throughout many portions of my life. It served me when I was, let's see, I served in the Civil Service Commission. I served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Served as Police Commissioner. I served as also the Governor of New York and the Vice President of the United States. But I will say that quite possibly the thing that it truly helped me with was becoming President of the United States. It is very helpful to know that you need to work with people. Sometimes you need to take a stand, but sometimes you can look for help from others. And that is the sort of thing that truly helped me. I will say that also, if it was not for my time in the Badlands ranching, well, I might never have become the President of the United States. It certainly renewed me and my spirit and helped me prepare for what came next. I had a fine time out there in the Badlands learning about my ability to command as well. We had a very difficult time of it one day because it was a long winter. And in the winter, we have a very small river, the Little Missouri. It was the only means of transportation along the waters was this very small boat. And there was a trio of thieves who they had been out and about doing some very unpleasant things and were trying to get out of town. And they found my one little boat and they stole it. Well, I discovered this after they had left. But since there was only one place you can go in a boat, and that is up the river, well, then we worked together and some of my ranch hands worked very quickly and we built another boat out of a log. And we sailed up the Little Missouri River and we caught those boat thieves and brought them back. We worked together, and sometimes I had to make sure that they were not going anywhere all by myself. But even after the thieves were captured, I even read to them books so that they would be entertained on the trip back to prison. So don't say that I can't do nice things for people even if they have done something worthy of being arrested. But I will say my time as president was one of my favorite times. I dare say that no man ever enjoyed himself as much as I did in the White House. We had a wonderful time of it. Oh, it was a fine time. I enjoyed having my hand on the lever and being part of the action, taking strides to make our country better, to help the people, the hard-working, plain people of this country. And I worked with them in a number of different things. I worked on taking down some of the more unpleasant corporations and monopolies that were trying to take advantage of the smaller businesses and the American people. And that gained me the name of Trustbuster, which is a name I did not like, but I certainly enjoyed making a difference for the people. I also made sure that, of course, that they were safe, and with passing such things as the Pure Food and Drug Act, which, of course, was a means of making sure that the food that we ate was what we thought we were eating. I realize that some of you are recently from lunch or perhaps just about to it, so I will spare you from some of the more unpleasant details of what was going on behind the scenes with our food, but this helped us to make sure that what we were eating was what we thought we were eating. But I also worked alongside creating the canal in Panama, It was an American engineering marvel, making sure that we had a fine selection of ability for our commercial and naval vessels to travel through the canal to more quickly reach both sides of the country, to protect our shores and to ensure greater commerce. But I will say that one of my most proud accomplishments is setting aside the hundreds upon thousands of acres for our future generations. I had a fine time making sure that the beauty of nature was protected in this country so that our children's children might receive the benefit. I can remember there was a time when I was out traveling amongst some of our early national parks, and I went to the Grand Canyon. I don't know if any of you have been to the Grand Canyon, but it is a beautiful sight, and no words can accurately describe it. But I will tell you that seeing it, it was a wondrous sight. And then I discovered that at some point, the Santa Fe Railroad had thought about placing a hotel right on the edge of the Grand Canyon. It was a terrible thing. Oh, it would have made a terrible sight, and it would have destroyed the beauty of the Grand Canyon. Fortunately, they did not build the hotel there, but it reminded me of the difficult things I had seen at the Niagara Falls area. They had put a lot of tourist trappings up and different things like that, and that was not very pretty. And I thought it was more important to protect the land for future generations. And so I worked alongside many, including, I see that you have a picture of myself with John Muir, the wilderness prophet. We worked together. That is in the Yosemite. That is up at the top of Glacier Point. We had a fine time traveling throughout the Yosemite, and I was persuaded to protect more lands. And I told people to save the land because we could not build upon it, but I believed that other people should be able to. I believe that other people should be able to enjoy it. But unfortunately, having a national park made was the responsibility of the Congress, and they were very slow to make things happen. But fortunately, something came along called an Act for Preserving America's Antiquities, or the Antiquities Act, as some people would call it. And here it says that the President of the United States is hereby authorized in his discretion to declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest that are situated on the lands owned or controlled by the government of the United States to be national monuments, which simply meant that instead of waiting for Congress to call the Grand Canyon a national park, I simply called it a national monument instead, and I walked around the Congress entirely. And they were angry at my trying to do that so quickly. But I believed that it was more important to make sure that lands such as the Grand Canyon and the Devil's Tower and El Chocum and El Morro could be preserved right away so that people might enjoy the benefit of it. As I said, nature served me well, and I tried to serve nature well throughout my life. Of course, we also had a fine time in the presidency because I had my family with me. I had 6 children with me. And, my wife would say we had 7 children, including me. But I was very happy to have my children with me. They played throughout the house. Oh, they would have all sorts of fun. I'm happy to answer more questions about that later, but I will tell you that they had a very good time. Oh, yes, there's my one of my boys, Kermit, there with I believe that's Jack there, the little terrier there. But we had a fine time together. And of course, the young boys, Archie and Quentin, would create what they called a White House gang, in which they traveled throughout the grounds, and they would do all sorts of terrible things. They would throw spitballs at the portraits of the former presidents, and they would throw snowballs down from the roof of the White House down onto the police. But they had a good time of it, and we had all sorts of fun. And one of the things that I enjoyed doing was writing to my children. Now, one of the other things that I did in my lifetime was I was an author. When I was not busy being the president or other things, I also wrote books. And one of my favorite books was the very last book that we put together, called Theodore Roosevelt's Letters to His Children. And this book has some of my favorite things. I believe this was the best biography of me ever. I thought that no other book presented me in such a good light as this book, because it was simply me talking to my children. And I very much enjoyed doing that. And I would very much like to share with you a couple of very brief letters which I wrote to my children. This one is a letter that I wrote to Ethel when I was in Colorado out hunting. Here I say, "Darling little Ethel, I have had great fun. Most of the trip neither you nor mother nor sister would enjoy, but you would all be immensely amused with the dogs. There are 11 all told, but really only 8 do very much hunting. These 8 are all scarred with the wounds they have received this very week in battling with the cougars and the lynxes, and they are always threatening to fight one another. But they are as affectionate towards men, and especially towards me, because I pet them, as our own home dogs. And at this moment, a large hound and a half-breed bulldog, both of whom were quite badly wounded this morning by a cougar, are shoving their noses into my lap to be petted and humming defiance to one another. They are on excellent terms with the ranch cats and kittens. The 3 chief fighting dogs who do not follow the trail are the most affectionate of all. And moreover, they climb trees. Yesterday, we got a big lynx in the pinion of a tree, top of a pinyon tree, a low spreading kind of pine about 30 feet tall. Turk the bloodhound followed him up, and after much sprawling, actually got to the very top of the tree, and after within a couple of feet of him. And then when the lynx was shot out of the tree, Turk, after a short scramble, took a header down through the branches and landing with a bounce on his back. Tony, one of the half-breed bulldogs, takes such headers on at least an average of at least once for every animal we put up a tree. There is also another letter. This one I wrote to Kermit. This is a letter about a couple of our pets, including his dog, Jack. Dear Kermit, this was after he had gone off to boarding school. We felt very melancholy after you and Ted left and the house seemed empty and lonely. But it was really the greatest possible comfort to feel that you both have enjoyed school and are doing very well there. Tom Quartz is the most cunningest kitten I have ever seen. He is always playing pranks on Jack, and I get very nervous lest Jack should grow too irritated. The other evening they were both in the library, Jack sleeping before the fire, Tom Quartz scampering about, an exceedingly playful little creature, which is about what he is. He would race across the floor and then jump on the curtain or play with the tassel. And suddenly he spied Jack and galloped up to him. Jack, looking exceedingly sullen and shamefaced, jumped out of the way and got on the sofa. Where Tom Quartz instantly jumped upon him again. And Tom Quartz, Jack suddenly shifted to the other sofa, where Tom Quartz again went after him. And then Jack started for the door, while Tom made a rapid turn under the sofa, around the table, and just as Jack reached the door, leaped on his hindquarters. Jack bounded forward, and away the two went tandem out of the room, Jack not appearing at all, and after about 5 minutes, Tom Quartz stopped solemnly back. Another evening, the next speaker of the House, Mr. Cannon, an exceedingly solemn elderly gentleman with chin whiskers. I believe there's actually a portrait of him. You get an idea of what Mr. Cannon looks like, yes. Oh, there he is. Oh, yes. He certainly does not look to be a playful creature. He came to call upon me, and after we had had our business, he went down about halfway down the stairs when Tom Quartz strolled by, his tail erect and very fluffy, and he spied Mr. Cannon going down the stairs and jumped to the conclusion that this was a playmate escaping, and he raced after Mr. Cannon. And he suddenly grasped him by the leg the way he does Archie and Quentin when they are playing hide and seek with him. Oh, excuse me. Then, loosening his hold, he tore down the stairs ahead of Mr. Cannon, who eyed him with iron calm and not one particle of surprise. And I suppose you can imagine a lack of surprise from Mr. Cannon looking at that picture. But the most important thing I tried to impart to my children was to be grateful for what we had. And this is the last bit that I thought I should share with you. This was a letter that I wrote to Kermit after we were getting ready for the election of 1904, and it was uncertain as to whether or not I would actually be re-elected. I have not any idea whether we will win or not. Before election, I shall send you my guess as to the way the different states will vote, and then you can keep it and see how near to the truth I come. But of course, you will remember that it is more a mere guess, and that I may be utterly mistaken along the line. In any event, even if I am beaten, you must remember that we have had 3 years of great enjoyment out of the presidency, and that we are mighty lucky to have had them. This was something I tried to impart in my children from the very beginning, to be grateful for what we had, to know that each opportunity may be our last, and to enjoy it to the full. And that is what I try to impart to my children. I strongly encourage reading this book when you get a chance. But you'll forgive me, I'm going to have to switch my spectacles. I fear I'm getting a bit warm for being able to keep them on. These are what we call pince-nez, and they are only happy if I am not particularly warm. And as it is a summer's day here at Sagamore, I'm going to have to put on the more difficult riding spectacles. There we are. Yes, much better.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. President. That was wonderful. We have, if you have time, we have some questions from some of our viewers. And I want to welcome, we've got people from all over the country, some folks from Fort Worth and Frisco, Texas, some folks from Colorado, in the Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, Ohio, really all around the country. It's quite wonderful.
That's splendid. Oh, it is wonderful to have everyone from so many far reaches of this country gathered together in one simple venue.
It's terrific. So I want to remind everyone how to ask your questions. Use the chat box in YouTube, and we will try and get through as many as we can. We've got a few that have come through. One that was quite interesting, and I didn't quite catch it. You started to talk about the food you were eating and some changes in policy so people would know. Could you explain that a little bit more? What were people eating before this change, or it was just more information?
Well, I will tell you that the Pure Food and Drug Act, if you are truly, if you are of a more stern and strong stomach, you might wish to look into The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which is a very descriptive advent of all the difficulties that were happening in the meat packing industry. And I will simply say that a number of the things that were going into sausages and being done with the cuts were not particularly the most healthy that you would ever find. And so we needed to make sure that we were not letting our people, our good countrymen, eat rancid meat. And so we wanted to make sure that they had the opportunity to have, well, quality food expected of them. And so that was what the Pure Food and Drug Act was about, as well as making sure that medicines that were coming about were actually doing the job that they promised. If they were meant to help you feel healthier, they should not be made from, I don't know, turpentine. It's always about doing what is honestly expected of you. That was one of the most important things about the Pure Food and Drug Act.
Very good. That's helpful to have that context.
Of course.
After you left office, how did you reflect on your time and your legacy? You've touched on a couple of things that were very important to you. Did you see your legacy changing after you were out of office, or how did you feel about that?
Well, I will say that I felt that when I left office, I decided that I should not run for a third term of office at the time, because there was nothing stopping me from serving in multiple terms of office. There was no amendment to that point. But at this point, I determined that I should serve 2 terms of office and leave it at that. And I chose my successor, William Howard Taft, a very good fellow, a good sizable fellow. And I believe that he reflected my policies, that he would continue on the things that we had begun, the progressive issues that tried to make this country better. And so I campaigned for Mr. Taft to become the next president, and he was handily elected. But the trouble was that I fear that he began to leave behind some of the ideas that I had put forward. Conservation was almost abandoned, and corruption began to find its way back into the government buildings. And I felt that some of the important reforms that I had put forward were being abandoned or forgotten. And so I wanted to make sure that this country, not just because of my legacy, but to make sure that the country's legacy would continue on in a fine fashion. And that is why I determined in 1912 that I should, after much persuasion, that I should challenge Mr. Taft for the nomination of the Republican Party as president. But eventually, of course, the Republicans were entrenched with him. And in 1912, I served as a candidate for the Progressive Party, trying to bring to the American people all the different progressive reforms that I thought would serve this country well. And then, unfortunately, the Democrats picked Woodrow Wilson. And then, of course, neither one of us, Taft or myself, ended up winning the White House. So I fear the kaleidoscope had shifted. But if I would know anything, it is that the lands that I have protected, I would say 530 million acres, give or take an acre, of national parks and national monuments and national forests, wildlife refuges and bird sanctuaries, they continue on to give the people an enjoyment of nature, which I believe truly benefits the body and the mind. And so if I can have any sort of legacy, I think it might be that.
Very good. You mentioned the Progressive Party. So what did it mean to be part of the Bull Moose Party?
Oh, the Bull Moose Party. I shall simply give you the aside to say that one day, while we were out campaigning, I said that I felt fit as a bull moose. And that's the reason that the Progressive Party sprouted antlers. But being a progressive was meaning to make changes in the government that were benefiting the people and not the governing. To make sure that the governed were taken care of rather than protecting the people who were actually governing. Because in my lifetime, a number of our politicians were simply concerned with their own well-being. They were more concerned with making sure that their pockets were well lined than the people were protected. And so we wanted to make sure that those who lived, earned a good solid day's wage, made a contribution to this country, living good lives as citizens of this country, had just as much opportunity to benefit from what this nation had to offer as anyone else. And so that was what being a progressive was about. We put together all sorts of reforms that had been brought up by some of my other progressive fellow candidates and politicians, making sure that conservation continued, having a social insurance for the security of old age, making sure that women had the right to vote, making sure that people were protected from having untoward actions in their lives, making sure that they could have their voices heard, having a presidential primary rather than a direct caucuses. There were many things that were not in effect in my lifetime that we wanted to see happen. But I fear that a number of those activities were not made into reality within my lifetime because they were too radical to make sure that the people were taken care of. So,
was it during that campaign? I believe I read that you were shot. You got up and gave a speech and refused to go to the hospital.
Well, I did not think that I was in much danger at the time. I was actually on the way to the platform when a rather, well, after looking upon him, after they captured him, there was very little life left in his eyes, and it could be very easily seen that he was not quite there anymore, unfortunately. Mr. Schrank, I believe. And of course, when I was shot right in the chest. And I always made it a point to keep make sure I kept my speech with me and I had my glasses case with me, and the bullet actually pierced both of them, but it slowed it down enough that it kept it from going very far. And when I if you will forgive me, those of you of a more delicate nature might wish to cover your ears for a moment. But after I was shot, I coughed to make sure that there was no blood coming out of my mouth. And seeing that that did not happen, that meant to me that there was no blood in my lungs, and so that I should be safe to continue to speak. And so I did so. And I spoke much more quietly than I even am today. And I told the good people, I do not know if you are aware, but I have just been shot. And they did not know that I was speaking the truth or not, but they thought perhaps it was some sort of campaign folderol. But the truth of the matter was I had been shot. And I kept speaking to the best of my ability, especially because my speech had been tattered by the bullet. And so I spoke a little more than an hour. And then finally, my campaign aides convinced me that I should at least stop in at the hospital to make sure that nothing untoward had happened. And so that was how I continued to speak for over an hour. But it takes more than that to kill a bull moose.
Well, we're glad not more than that happened. You talked about the book that you wrote. Do you like to read, and what kinds of things do you like to read?
I am a voracious reader. I enjoy reading so very much. Throughout the course of my life, I enjoyed writing books. By the time I started, when I was about 20 years old, I wrote a book on the history of the naval war of 1812, the naval battles, if you will. And I will say that in my writing it rivaled the dictionary for dryness. But I got better over time. I improved, and I wrote on the lives of different historic figures, Governor Morris and Thomas Hart Benton, and I wrote about my travels to Africa. I wrote about my time in the Rough Riders and the war against the Spanish. I began to do that, but I also thoroughly enjoyed reading. I enjoyed reading immensely. When I went even to Africa, when we were shooting animals to capture them as specimens for the Smithsonian Institution and the American Museum of Natural History, I made sure I took a set of books of about 100 books, called them my pigskin library, because they were covered in a very rough pigskin leather, which would weather all the different difficulties, including having to clean anything that would come out of hunting in the process, if you understand my meaning. But I carried things as Don Quixote and Lewis Carroll, as well as a number of simple other books of various histories and things of that. As long as I could read it, I was happy to go through it. I read about a book a day, I would say. So we had a lovely time with that. But I was always wanting to make sure that what I had was available to me to enjoy and to read. But I had a wonderful time. I read Shelley's poems. I read Bacon's essays. I read some of Sherlock Holmes. I read some of Milton and Keats. I quite enjoyed whatever I could get my hands on.
All right. I'd like to get a couple more questions in before we have to go.
Oh, of course.
Could you talk a little bit about the San Juan Hill experience?
Oh, San Juan Hill. Yes. I will simply say that for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Spanish had occupied Cuba for decades and were treating them very poorly. And it took an act of Congress. McKinley had the backbone of a chocolate eclair, but Congress did finally declare war. And then, of course, I led a cavalry unit, a volunteer cavalry unit, the first cavalry unit of the war with the Spanish. And we went down to Cuba. And unfortunately, while we were a cavalry unit, because there was very little room on the ships, we had to leave most of our horses behind. We were called the Rough Riders, but for quite a while, we were also called the Weary Walkers because we had no horses to speak of. But it was very interesting. I had a great many good, solid men in our unit. We had knickerbockers, men from Harvard and Princeton and Yale, but we also had cowboys and ranchers and Civil War generals from the North and the South, I will say. And they all worked together. I called them a typical American regiment because each of them was willing to serve and sacrifice to the best of their ability without regard for their own station. I would see the well-to-do lads washing the dishes just as quickly as the cowboys would. They were very happy to serve together, shoulder to shoulder. And so we traveled in the beginning of July. After about a week in the jungles, working against an enemy we could not see, we were making our way down to the base of what they called Kettle Hill. And of course, we were under great enemy fire. And I had thought that we should charge the hill. And I was not the only one who thought so. My fellow men thought we should charge as well. And so I sought out the command from the generals. And finally, we, the volunteer unit, we charged ahead of the regulars, and we took heavy casualties, but we braced Kettle Hill. And then we found that they were fighting near the blockhouses on what they called San Juan Hill. And I ordered the men to follow me, and 5 of them did. Because, well, they didn't hear me. The rest of the men were so caught up, they couldn't actually hear me call for them to charge. And so I told them to follow me, and they did. And we helped to take the blockhouses and circle back and fend off the counterattackers. It was a great crowded hour of my life. And I will say that it certainly gave me a great deal more attention. It was a bully good fight for Cuba and the United States, but it was a bully good fight for me too. Got me back into the politics and serving as the governor after that.
Do you have your cowboy hat?
I have some hats. They are off. Actually, one of my hats is over sitting on a rhinoceros's horns. But a number of them actually, some of my ones are actually in museums. A number of hats there. But I always did enjoy a good broadly brimmed hat. When I was actually nominated for the vice presidency, I was wearing a rather big, what you might call a cowboy hat. And I was wearing it. And when I went up on the stage to say a few words, they said to me, "Oh, Colonel Roosevelt, he's going to fight for the vice presidency." But the truth of it was, I was wearing a cowboy hat because I had been playing with my children that morning. And in the rough and tumble, I got a scratch on my head and I wanted to cover it up. And so I wore the cowboy hat instead. But I still became vice president.
Well, you've had many experiences that were rough and tumble, but I want to close with a question about that we have some knowledge of, but you could explain the reference of a teddy bear and you.
Oh, yes, that is quite an interesting situation. I never expected it to come to that, to be quite honest. Of all the things that I thought I would be remembered for, bears, well, not that kind of bear. I will simply say that I was out hunting in Mississippi, and we had been bear hunting, and everyone had found a trophy except for me. And the trouble was that they knew I was the president at the time, and they did not want the president to not have a trophy. And so the fellows there, they found this poor old bear who had seen better days, and they used dogs to tree her and capture her, and she was wounded and she was bitten and she was in terrible shape. And so she was, they tied her up to a tree, and they found me and then said, "Mr. President, we have found your bear." And they presented me with this pitiful specimen of a bear. And I did not think it was fair to shoot the animal. Now, I will say that in full honesty, that while I did not shoot the bear, I did not think that the bear had much more life in her. And so I asked that they would put her out of her misery, to be as polite as possible about it. And that was done to make sure, because she was not long for this world otherwise. But in the course of it, in the record of my action, a bit of a cartoon came about, as you see here. And this is a drawing of me refusing to shoot the bear. And this became very popular, and it kept being, it was drawn and redrawn. And as it kept being redrawn and then sold, actually, every time it got redrawn, the bear got smaller and younger and cuter. And it looked by the end as if I was trying to shoot a 6-week-old cub, which was not the case at all. But eventually, I was called upon by a fellow in New York, and he had this idea that he should sell a group of bears, little stuffed animals, based on this little story. And he asked if he contacted me and asked if he could sell them as Teddy's bears. And I told him that would be fine. You are more than welcome to call them Teddy's bears, but I don't think that you will sell very many of them because of it. And but he took the risk, and I dare say that I'm guessing there is a large amount of you out there watching this moment at this moment who have or have had a teddy bear. And of course, there is this much like this little fellow. This is one of the original, this is what the originals looked like. The one that, of course, that our family had at some point actually went to the Smithsonian eventually. But this is a replica of that. But I dare say that a number of you have had bears, and if they have brought joy to your life, well, then I will happily have my name attached to such an animal.
Very good. Do you happen to know who drew the cartoon?
It was Clifford Berryman, I believe, Mr. Berryman, which was
it.
Berry, B-E-R-R-Y, not B-A-E-A-R-Y, yes.
We are familiar with him because his cartoons have ended up in the National Archives. So there's quite a collection. So we're pleased to have you represented as yourself and as a bear in the National Archives.
Yes, well, I'm just happy to be remembered properly. That will do me very well.
Well, Mr. President, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're delighted to have you as we've run out of time. And we wish you all the best with the rest of your day.
I thank you very much. I appreciate everyone's attention, and it has been a delightful time talking with you today. Have a wonderful day.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I want to thank everyone else who's joined us today. We truly appreciate all of our donors and members, those from all around the country who have joined us. You might be like me, an armchair historian or a civically engaged citizen or a genealogy person. The National Archives has something for all of you, and the National Archives Foundation does. So if you're interested in becoming a member or a donor, visit thearchivesfoundation.org. And as you might have heard me say in a previous program, we have one of the best gift shops. Okay, it is the best gift shop in Washington and online. So visit us online. We have some Teddy Roosevelt materials, as well as some other things that are available in all kinds, other presidents, I should say, as well as other things that are connected to U.S. history and the records that are held in the National Archives. So visit nationalarchivesstore.org to take a look at what we've got, and we've got a sale going on as well. So don't miss it. You should stay tuned for some of our programming that's coming up. I'm going to take a little break. We've had 2 this week, but at the end of the month, we have the history of chocolate. It will be, trust me, a delicious program with Dave Bergasani of the American Heritage Chocolate and Mars Company. He does a great program, so I hope you'll tune in for that. And then in August, I want to tease you a little bit. We've got some fantastic programming, quite a bit of programming coming up in conjunction with the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the centennial of women's rights to vote. So you probably have heard of the Rightfully Hers exhibition that is up at the National Archives, currently unavailable to be visited at the moment, but that's been our big initiative for the last year. And since we're closed to the public for the exhibit, we've got a lot of virtual programming that'll be happening in August. So stay tuned and be watching for that. We'll have some things for all kinds of audiences, especially the week of the anniversary. So with that, everyone, on behalf of the National Archives Foundation, I want to thank you for joining us today. Until our next program, be safe and be well.